Powder River Basin, Wyoming Territory, January 9th, 1881. A circuit preacher named Edmund Farr knocked 3 times on the door of a cabin he had never seen before, on a night when the mercury read -31 degrees and his horse was lame, and the last homestead had turned him away because they had no heat to spare. The woman who opened the door was Hester Crane, 44 years old, a widow, and she pulled him inside without asking questions. She sat him by the fire and wrapped his feet and gave him warm water, and at 10 o'clock she banked the hearth and went to bed. She did not get up in the night. At 4 in the morning, Edmund Farr woke in the dark to a dead fire and a cabin that should have been killing cold. The floor beneath him was warm. He pressed his hand to it. Stone. Warm stone, 6 hours after the last flame. He lay there in the dark for a long time, his palm flat against something he could not explain. What he was lying on, and what that woman had spent the autumn building while every neighbor in the basin watched and shook their heads, would become one of the most quietly repeated stories in the history of the Powder River Basin. 3 months earlier, on October 6, 1880, the creek that ran along the southern edge of Hester Crane's 160 acres was low and slow in the way creeks got in October when the summer runoff had long since passed and the ground was beginning to harden but had not yet frozen. And on the morning of the 6th, with the first frost of the season still white on the grass at 7 o'clock, Hester was standing in the middle of it, water to her shins, bending down and lifting stones. The cabin her late husband Amos had built in the spring of 1877 was a conventional single-room structure of chinked logs with a stone hearth at the eastern wall, a sleeping loft accessed by a pegged ladder, a puncheon floor of split pine logs, and 2 south-facing windows covered with oiled hide. Amos had built well. He had been a quiet and precise man who measured things twice and cut them once and did not tolerate sloppiness in himself or in his materials. And the cabin reflected that quality in its tight joints and its straight walls and its roof that had not leaked in 3 years. Amos had died in the summer of 1878 when his horse threw him crossing a dry wash 4 miles from the cabin, and he landed on a rock that broke 3 ribs and punctured his left lung. He was dead before sundown. He was 39 years old. He left Hester with the 160 acres, a horse, 4 chickens, a modest store of provisions, and the cabin he had built to a standard that had already survived 2 Wyoming winters without structural failure. The problem was not the cabin. The cabin was sound. The problem was what the cabin cost to heat. In her second winter alone, the winter of 1879, Hester had burned through 13 cords of wood between November and March. 13 cords for a single-room cabin of no more than 280 square feet. She'd been up at 3 in the morning, at 4, at 5, feeding the hearth in the dark, climbing down the loft ladder in her coat and boots, her breath visible in the cold interior air, her hands shaking until the fire came back and the heat reached her fingers. The puncheon floor was the worst of it. Pine is not a material that holds warmth. It takes the fire's heat, absorbs it for a few minutes, and then releases it back into the cold air as soon as the fire dies down. And by 3 in the morning, 4 hours after the last feeding, the floor temperature in the cabin was functionally the same as the outside temperature. The cold came up through the floor and into everything, the quilts, the clothing, the bones. She had spent 13 cords of wood fighting a floor that refused to hold on to anything she gave it. In February of 1880, during the last serious cold snap of that winter, a section of the puncheon floor near the northeast corner of the cabin gave way. 3 of the split pine logs had rotted through from below where moisture had accumulated against the undressed underside, and one morning Hester stepped on the section and felt it sag and heard the wet crack of compromised timber and stepped back quickly and looked at the gap. The gap was roughly 4 feet by 3 feet, the earth beneath it visible and cold and damp. She did not have replacement timber available, not in February, not with the ground frozen to 2 feet and the nearest tradable lumber at the settlement of Corbin's Fork, 14 miles south. She needed something to cover the gap so she could walk across it without stepping into the earth. She went to the lean-to beside the cabin where she stored tools and found a stack of flat river stones she had collected the previous summer with the vague intention of building a step at the front entrance, a project she had not completed. She carried the stones inside and laid them across the gap, fitting them together as tightly as she could, a rough mosaic of flat creek stone covering the exposed earth. She did not think about it further. It was a temporary fix. She intended to replace the boards in the spring when timber became available. But 3 days after she laid the stones, she noticed something. She noticed it first with her feet, which is how most people notice temperature, through the soles of their boots or the bare skin of their feet against a surface, and what she noticed was that the stone section of the floor was warmer than the pine section. Not dramatically warmer. Not the warmth of a fire or a heated brick, but measurably, consistently, detectably warmer to the touch than the surrounding timber floor at the same time of day, specifically in the early morning hours when the fire had been dead or banked for 4 or 5 hours and the rest of the cabin was at its coldest. She noticed it on the first morning, and then she deliberately checked it on the second morning and the third and the fourth, crouching at the edge of the stone section and pressing one palm to the stone and one palm to the pine and comparing what she felt. The stone was warmer every time. She did not understand why. She simply recorded the observation and kept it. She thought about it through the spring and into the summer with a particular persistent quality of attention that had characterized her thinking for as long as she could remember, the inability to let go of a question that had not been satisfactorily answered. She thought about it while planting, while hauling water, while mending the chicken coop. By July, she had what she considered a sufficient answer. Stone was denser than wood. It was heavier, more tightly packed at the material level, and that density meant that when the hearth fire heated the cabin during the day, the stone absorbed that heat more slowly than the pine, but held onto it longer, releasing it gradually through the night in a slow, sustained output that the pine could not match, because pine was porous and light and gave up its heat as quickly as it took it in. The pine floor was a borrower. It took the warmth and spent it immediately. The stone floor was something else. It took the warmth and saved it, and gave it back hours later when the fire was dead, and the cold was at its worst, and nobody was awake to do anything about it. She tested her theory by placing a heated iron near both surfaces and timing how long each one remained warm to the touch. The pine was cool within 20 minutes. The stone held detectable warmth for over 2 hours from a single heated iron. She did not need to run the test again. On October 4th, 1880, she walked to the creek and began hauling stones. She had calculated the requirement through September, measuring the cabin floor area, estimating the stone coverage per sack, estimating the number of trips. The cabin floor was 280 square feet. She needed roughly 4 inches of depth across the entire surface for adequate thermal mass, which meant approximately 6,000 pounds of riverstone, which meant roughly 150 sacks at 40 pounds each, which meant 75 round trips from the creek to the cabin at 2 sacks per trip. She had budgeted 38 days of hauling at 2 trips per day, which would bring her to November 11th with a margin of 1 week before the ground typically froze hard enough to close the creek crossing for winter. Ira Gould saw her on October 8th, the 3rd day of hauling. Gould's property bordered Hester's to the northwest, 600 acres of open range on which he ran cattle and grew enough hay to feed them through the winter, and he had been riding the fence line, checking for breaks when he saw her walking up the track from the creek with a canvas sack on her back, bent forward against the weight, her boots leaving deep prints in the softening trail. He reined his horse and watched her for a moment. He was 51 years old, broad and weathered in the way that men who had spent 7 years on the Powder River were weathered, the wind and the cold and the work having stripped away whatever had been soft in him and leaving behind a man of fixed opinions and considerable volume. He considered himself an authority on the practical realities of frontier life in the Basin, because 7 years had not yet proved him wrong about anything significant enough to require him to reconsider, which is a particular kind of confidence that feeds on its own uninterrupted record. He called out to her from the fence line, "Mrs. Crane, what have you got in that sack?" Hester stopped and set the sack down and straightened her back. "Stones," she said. "Stones." He looked at the sack. He looked at the trail behind her leading back toward the creek. He looked at her. What do you want with stones? I am laying a floor. Gould stared at her for a moment in the particular way he stared at things that did not fit the categories he had already established, which was to say, with a combination of puzzlement and the preparatory contempt of a man who is about to form a judgment. You have a floor, he said. I am replacing it. With stones. Yes. Mrs. Crane, a stone floor in a Wyoming cabin is about the most foolish thing I have heard this year, and it has been a long year for foolish things. Stone draws the cold. You will freeze faster with a stone floor than you would sleeping on the bare ground. Every man in this basin knows that. He gathered his reins with the finality of a man who has delivered a verdict and considers the matter closed. I am telling you this as your neighbor. Hester picked up her sack. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Gould, she said, and continued walking. If you have been with this story to this point, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Every subscription makes it possible for us to keep finding stories like this one. Now let us see what that stone floor did when the winter of 1880 came to the Powder River Basin. She finished the floor on November 9th, 2 days ahead of her projected schedule. The final surface was a continuous interlocking layer of flat river stone covering the entire 280 square feet of the cabin floor, 4 inches deep, mortared with a mixture of creek clay and coarse sand she had collected and processed in the same patient systematic manner she had collected the stones, mixing each batch to the same consistency, pressing it into the gaps with her hands, and a flat wooden tool she had carved from a piece of scrap pine. The clay and sand mortar served 2 purposes. It locked the stones into a continuous surface that would not shift underfoot, and it filled the gaps between the stones so that the thermal mass was unbroken, a single continuous slab of dense material covering every inch of the cabin floor. She let the mortar cure for 4 days before building the first full fire on November 13th, keeping the hearth loaded with dry pine and oak from morning through evening, feeding it steadily for 10 hours, allowing the heat to saturate the room and begin the slow process of charging the stone floor with the day's accumulated warmth. She stayed awake that first night later than she normally would, checking the floor temperature with her palm every hour, pressing her hand flat to the stone beside the hearth, and then at the center of the room, and then at the far corner by the door, mapping the distribution of warmth across the surface. At 10 o'clock, the fire was banked. At midnight, the stone beside the hearth was warm to the touch in a way that was immediately different from anything the pine floor had produced. At 2 in the morning, she checked again. Still warm. At 4, she checked again. Still detectably warm, not hot, not comfortable exactly, but measurably above the air temperature inside the cabin, which had dropped to 41 degrees while the floor surface held at approximately 54. She had not fed the fire since 10 o'clock. 6 hours. The stone was holding. She went to sleep. She did not set an alarm for 3 or 4 or 5. She woke at 6:30 when the light came through the oiled hide windows, gray and flat and cold, and the first thing she did was press her palm to the stone beside her bed, and the stone was 51 degrees. 8.5 hours after the last feeding, with no attention, no intervention, no one climbing down a ladder in the dark to crouch at a hearth and blow on coals that might or might not catch, the floor was holding warmth. Not much. Enough. Enough that the cabin interior had not dropped below 44 degrees at any point in the night. Enough that her water bucket beside the door had not filmed with ice, which it had done every night of the previous winter by 3 in the morning. Enough that when she rebuilt the fire in the morning, the cabin came back to comfortable temperature, in a third of the time it had taken the previous year because it was starting from 44 instead of 28. She recorded the figures in a small notebook she had been keeping since October. Outside temperature, floor temperature at 3 locations, air temperature at waking, wood consumed. She would keep this notebook through the entire winter without missing a morning. The winter of 1880 arrived in the basin in the second week of December, with the particular totality that Wyoming winters brought when they were serious, the temperature dropping from 22 degrees on December 9th to -6 on December 11th without passing through any intermediate stages, as if someone had opened a door and let the actual winter in after weeks of mere rehearsal. Ira Gould burned through his first cord of wood in 3 days. He had laid in 18 cords in October, which he considered a responsible provision, and by Christmas he was calculating the rate of consumption against the remaining supply with the arithmetic of a man who does not like what the numbers say, but cannot make them say anything different. His sons were up in shifts through the night feeding the hearth. His wife, Margaret, slept in her coat from December 15th onward. His cattle were managed through continuous effort, extra straw, broken ice, midnight checks that cost him sleep he could not replace. He said nothing about any of this at the trading post in Corbin's Fork, because he was not a man who admitted difficulty, and because every other man at the trading post was managing the same difficulty, and everyone knew it without anyone having to say it. On the night of January 9th, 1881, the mercury at Corbin's Fork dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, the lowest temperature recorded in the Powder River Basin in 7 years. The wind was from the north at 12 miles per hour sustained, which drove the effective temperature to something that killed exposed flesh in under 10 minutes and made the simple act of crossing a yard in negotiation with genuine danger. On that night, at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, a man appeared at Hester Crane's door. He knocked 3 times. He knocked weakly. Hester opened the door and found a man she had never seen before standing on her step in a coat that was not adequate for the temperature, his face gray-white around the nose and cheeks, his horse standing behind him with its head low and one foreleg lifted off the ground, in the way horses held a leg when something was wrong with it. The man said his name was Edmund Farr. He said he was a circuit preacher. He said his horse had gone lame 4 miles back, and he had walked the last 4 miles leading it, and he had been turned away from the Alderson place 3 miles north because they had no heat to spare, and he had seen her chimney smoke from the ridge and walked toward it. He said this in the slow, careful, overly precise manner of a man whose body was shutting down and whose mind was trying to maintain control of the situation through the disciplined use of language. Hester pulled him inside. She sat him beside the hearth. She pulled his boots off and checked his feet, which were white at the toes but not yet hard, which meant frostbite was beginning but had not completed its work. She wrapped his feet in wool and gave him heated water to drink, not hot, warm, because she knew from 2 winters alone that a frozen man given hot liquid too quickly could be harmed by the shock of it. She went outside and led his horse to the lean-to and checked the foreleg, which was strained but not broken, and gave the horse water and hay, and came back inside. Edmund Farr was sitting where she had left him, his hands around the warm cup, his body beginning the slow, painful process of accepting warmth back into itself, which is not the comfortable process most people imagine, but a burning, aching, deeply unpleasant recalibration that a body that has been seriously cold performs at its own pace, regardless of what the mind would prefer. She banked the fire at 10 o'clock, the same time she banked it every night. She laid 2 heavy oak logs on the coals and closed the damper to half. She showed Edmund Farr the bed she had made up for him on the floor beside the hearth, a wool blanket over a straw tick laid directly on the stone. He looked at the floor. He was lucid enough by then to notice what he was looking at, but too exhausted to ask about it. He lay down. He slept. Hester climbed the loft ladder and slept. At 4 o'clock in the morning on January 10th, 1881, Edmund Farr woke in the dark. The fire was dead. Not banked, not embers, dead. Gray ash and no flame. The cabin was dark, and the wind outside was audible in the way wind was audible when it was serious, not a sound but a pressure, a sustained leaning weight against the north wall. He lay still for a moment in the way a man lies still when he wakes in a strange place in the dark and is trying to determine how much trouble he is in. He had sheltered in 43 cabins in 4 months of winter circuit, riding from settlement to settlement across Wyoming and Montana, preaching on Sundays and accepting shelter through the week. And he had woken in the dark in every one of those cabins to the same thing: the fire dead or dying, the cold already inside the walls, the air sharp enough to see his breath in whatever moonlight came through the window. He knew what 4 in the morning felt like in a Wyoming cabin in January. It felt like the space between survival and failure. But something was different. The surface beneath him was warm, not the residual warmth of a banked fire, not the fading memory of heat. warm, in a sustained, even unhurried way that he could not account for because the fire was dead, and had been dead for what he estimated was at least 2 hours based on the state of the ash. He pressed his palm flat to the stone beside the straw tick. Warm. He pressed it again, further from the hearth, toward the center of the room. Warm. He lay there in the dark for a long time, with his hand on the stone floor of Hester Crane's cabin, trying to understand what he was feeling and failing to find a reference point for it in 43 cabins and 4 months of winter, and a lifetime of knowing what cold floors felt like in the dark. In the morning, Hester rebuilt the fire and made coffee and checked Edmund Farr's feet, which had regained their color and their feeling, which meant the frostbite had not progressed beyond the first stage and no tissue had been permanently lost. He sat at the table and drank the coffee and looked at the floor for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "I've sheltered in 43 cabins this winter. I've never once woken warm." "The stones hold the heat," Hester said. "How long?" 14 hours from a full day's fire, 8 to 10 from a banked evening fire. It depends on the outside temperature." He looked at the floor again. He got down from the chair and crouched and pressed his palm to the stone the way he had pressed it in the dark, and the stone was still warm at 8 in the morning, 10 hours after the fire had been banked, and he stayed crouching for a moment longer than was necessary, because he was feeling something that he wanted to remember precisely. He stood up. "I'm going to tell people about this floor," he said. "Tell whoever you like," Hester said. He stayed 2 days while his horse recovered. Hester showed him the notebook, the columns of figures, the outside temperature against the floor temperature against the wood consumed. She showed him the mortar work and the stone depth and the way the clay and sand mixture locked the surface into a continuous thermal mass. She explained it without drama and without pride, in the plain direct manner of a woman who had reasoned through a problem and solved it and did not require anyone else's amazement to validate the solution. Edmund Farr listened with the particular attention of a man whose profession was communication and who recognized in Hester's stone floor a piece of information that was going to be useful to a great many people across a great many cold nights. He left on January 12th, his horse sound enough to travel at a walk, and he rode south toward Corbin's Fork. He mentioned the floor in his sermon the following Sunday, not as the subject but as an illustration, the way preachers used the physical world to illuminate the metaphysical, and the illustration landed with a congregation that had spent the worst week of the winter feeding fires through the night and finding them dead by morning. 3 men asked him about it after the service. He told them what he had seen and what he had felt and what the figures in Hester Crane's notebook said. He told them the same thing at his next stop and the next and the next. And because Edmund Farr was a man who traveled continuously and spoke to more people in a month than most settlers spoke to in a year, the story of the stone floor moved through the Powder River Basin faster than any other piece of practical information had ever moved through it. Ira Gould heard about it from his son Caleb, who had heard about it from the Alderson boy at the trading post, who had heard about it from his father, who had heard it from the preacher. Gould listened to his son's account without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Caleb finished, Gould was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Go over there. Borrow the draw knife. Look at the floor while you're there." He did not say anything further. Caleb understood what his father was asking without his father having to say it directly, which was a form of communication that Caleb had learned to interpret by the time he was 12. Caleb rode to Hester's cabin the following morning. He was 17, quieter than his father, with the particular willingness to learn that young men had when their certainty had not yet calcified into something load-bearing. He asked to borrow the draw knife. Hester looked at him and looked at the draw knife hanging on the wall and understood exactly why Caleb Gould was standing in her cabin on a Tuesday morning in January. She took the draw knife down and handed it to him. Then she said, "Do you want to see the floor?" Caleb said yes. She showed him everything. The stone depth, the mortar composition, the interlocking pattern that prevented shifting, the way the thermal mass worked as a single continuous surface rather than as individual stones. She showed him the notebook. She answered his questions, which were better questions than she had expected, more specific, more structural, the questions of a boy who had watched things being built his whole life and understood materials even if he did not yet understand the principle she had discovered. She gave him a piece of brown paper on which she had drawn the stone laying pattern and the mortar specification and the optimal depth in her careful, angular handwriting. She gave it to him without his asking for it, because she understood that Caleb had not come of his own accord, and that whatever pride was preventing Ira Gould from walking through her door himself should not prevent the knowledge from reaching the people who needed it. Caleb rode home with the draw knife and the piece of brown paper. He gave both to his father. Gould read the paper slowly, studying the diagram and the specifications. He said nothing to Caleb about it. He said nothing to Margaret. He said nothing to anyone. But the following September, when the ground was soft enough to work and the creek was low enough to wade, Ira Gould spent 3 weeks hauling river stones from the same creek bed Hester Crane had hauled hers from, and by the first week of October, his cabin had a stone floor 4 inches deep, mortared with clay and sand mixed to the specification written on a piece of brown paper in a woman's careful, angular handwriting that he had never acknowledged and never returned and never mentioned to anyone. Edmund Farr continued his circuit through that spring and into the following winter, and the story of the stone floor traveled with him the way useful stories traveled on the frontier, not as news but as knowledge, accumulating credibility with each retelling because each person who heard it and tried it and reported back confirmed what the preacher had said. By the autumn of 1881, 7 families in the Powder River Basin had laid stone floors. By the autumn of 1882, the number was 19. None of them had met Hester Crane. Most of them had heard the story at second or third hand from a neighbor who had heard it from the preacher, or from someone who had heard it from someone who had heard it from the preacher. The knowledge moved through the basin like water moving through a creek bed, finding its own level, requiring no force and no authority, simply flowing toward the places where it was needed, because useful knowledge in a hard country does not require anyone to promote it. It promotes itself. Hester Crane lived on the Powder River property for another 23 years. She never remarried. She never sought recognition for the stone floor or for the notebook of figures that had started it. She replaced the mortar between the stones twice in 23 years, both times in the autumn, working the clay and sand mixture into the gaps with the same flat wooden tools she had carved from scrap pine in October of 1880. The floor outlasted everything else in the cabin. When the roof was replaced in 1891, the floor was untouched. When the south wall was reinforced in 1896, the floor was untouched. When Hester died on March 14, 1903, at the age of 67, the stone floor she had laid 23 years earlier was still there, still level, still warm every morning from a fire banked the night before, the clay mortar cracked in places but holding, the stones worn smooth by 2 decades of boots and bare feet, and the weight of a woman's daily life moving across them. The cabin was taken over by a family named Draper, who kept it for 11 years. And when they left in 1914, they left everything except what they could carry, and the stone floor remained, which is the nature of stone. It remains. It does not ask for attention. It does not announce what it is doing. It simply holds what it has been given and gives it back slowly, patiently, in the dark, when the fire's gone and no one is awake, and the cold is doing what the cold does, and the only thing standing between the people sleeping and the temperature outside is 4 inches of river stone and the warmth it remembered from the day before. There is something in this story that goes beyond survival technique or frontier ingenuity. Hester Crane did not inherit her knowledge from anyone. She did not carry it across an ocean or learn it from an elder or read it in a book. She discovered it by accident when her floor collapsed and she laid stones across the gap, and noticed 3 mornings later that her feet were warm in a place they had never been warm before. And then she did the thing that separates the people who discover useful things from the people who walk past them. She paid attention. She did not dismiss what she felt. She did not explain it away. She sat with the question for 8 months and reasoned through it and tested it. And when she was satisfied that she understood it, she acted on it with the thoroughness and patience of a woman who had learned that the most reliable things in the world are the things that work quietly while you sleep. The stone does not hurry. It does not burn bright and die fast the way wood does. It takes what is given slowly and holds it and releases it on its own schedule, in the dark, When no one is watching and no one is tending and no one is feeding it, that is not a survival technique. That is a way of living. Build the thing that works without you. Then rest. If this story has stayed with you, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. We find these stories because people like you make it possible to keep looking. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from and about a time when the simplest solution turned out to be the right one. We read everyone. The characters, names, locations, and specific events depicted in this story are fictional. The thermal mass principles described are based on documented building physics and historical construction practices. This story is presented for entertainment and educational purposes only.